For this episode, I thought I'd do something a bit different and just talk off script about the recent events in Syria, the overthrow of Bashar al Assad's regime, the background to it, perhaps how or why things happened, and then kind of talk about who might be the winners and losers in this situation. There may be no winners as it turns out, but we'll get into that. Syria has been run by the Assad family since 1971, first by the father, Hafiz al Assad, who died in 2000 and handed it over to Bashar al Assad. It's a brutal dictatorship, of course, like so many of the regimes in that area of the world, including people who we describe as our friends. It was no better or no worse than any of those. And it's not too many years ago that Bashar al Assad actually got a visit to Buckingham Palace and stayed overnight. And then he rode down the mall with Queen Elizabeth II. So apparently he was all right then. And along with Gaddafi in Libya, we used Assad's torture tables to ferry out jihadi prisoners there to be tortured, which we obviously couldn't do ourselves. This was during the so-called War on Terror. So he was useful for things like that. And then, of course, when he was of no further use, it was time to get rid of him. The Assad regime itself was completely corrupt. You'd probably not be surprised to learn. It was basically the military and cronies who scooped up everything that Syria had, whilst the people lived in pretty much abject poverty. So the US and Israel have long been obsessed with Syria and Assad. It was on this list of the famous list of 7 countries that was drawn up by neocons in the Bush administration that were to be subject to either regime change or invasion. So they've always been on the hit list. Assad identified himself as an Arab nationalist, and the US and Israel have always been far more fearful of Arab nationalists than they have of jihadists. They correctly identify that a united Arab population would be an enormous threat to Israel's escalation dominance in the region. So they prefer to have the chaos of jihadists in power in the region. It gives them a bogeyman, and of course, holding up the threat of terrorists abroad is always handy when you want to deprive people of their civil rights in your own country, all in the name of public safety and fighting terrorism. Assad has also always declared himself an implacable opponent of the occupation of Palestine. Syria itself, of course, the Golan Heights has been occupied since 1967. And so that also made him a target. There's also grand plans in the region to have pipelines which run through Syria. Now, in one version of this grand design, the pipeline would go to Israel and provide Israel with all its energy needs. The problem is they don't have a puppet government in Damascus, and that would be required to get this vision into reality. So that was an issue. As if all that wasn't enough, there's also the association with Russia. The old man, Assad, was very close to the Soviet Union, and after that fell and Bashar al-Assad succeeded him, he maintained pretty close links with Russia. The first attempt, of course, to overthrow Assad came with the Syrian civil war. The 2011 Arab Spring consisted of a number of attempts to overthrow regimes, popular uprisings in a number of the dictatorships in the Arab world. As expected, when demonstrations occurred in Syria, Assad responded brutally. A number of demonstrators were shot down in the street, people imprisoned, that type of thing. Now, this caused ructions within the Syrian army, some of whom defected and formed what was called the Free Syrian Army to fight the regime. They did have some limited clashes with the regular Syrian army. They controlled some pretty considerable territory at times, but over time they were more or less reduced to guerrilla attacks and lightning raids, that type of thing. And they never really numbered more than about 5,000 men in total. So, realizing this, the Obama administration in about 2012 or 2013 began a project called Timber Sycamore. So, the idea of this was that CIA black budget would be used to train and arm what they called moderate rebels in Syria. Now, of course, everybody knew by that time there were no moderate rebels in Syria. Al Qaeda had come in from Iraq, and we were just getting to the beginnings of other groups that would eventually become Islamic State. So the US government and everyone else knew what was going on. WikiLeaks was able to blow the lid on this in 2016 when they got hold of, for instance, there was the email from Jake Sullivan, which said Al Qaeda is on our side in Syria. And there was the admission of Hillary Clinton that she knew that arms supplies that were going to Gulf states were being immediately redirected to both Al Qaeda and what became Islamic State in Syria. The training was mainly managed by Jordanian and Turkish intelligence, with the CIA also involved on the ground. But what happened was, well, it was twofold. There was a lot of money embezzled out of the projects, and it also became a huge arms market. For instance, the people who were then calling themselves the Free Syrian Army were getting hold of all of these weapons, and as Islamic State said, the FSA were their biggest arms supplier. So the whole thing was a sham, and everybody knew that all of these resources were being directed to jihadist organizations. So, to everybody's surprise, the Assad regime actually survived. This was due to a few things. First of all, there was a crucial intervention by Russia in September of 2015. Their air force and some limited support on the ground was really a big benefit to the Syrian Arab Army in their battles against the rebels. They also had an enormous amount of help from both Hezbollah and other Iranian-backed proxies who came over the border from Iraq, and that really stiffened up the Syrian army, who the Syrian army also fought extremely well, and they were able to essentially prevail. They took back a lot of territory, including the very vital city of Aleppo, which is Syria's second city. So as the rebels started to suffer a few reverses, there were talks convened in Astana, which is in Kazakhstan, between Russia, Turkey, and Iran to try and find a solution or at least a ceasefire in Syria. The talks started in December 2016 or January 2017, depending on what source you take, and they eventually did result in a ceasefire. Under the terms of this, the jihadist groups returned to Idlib province, and they remained there and had that province under their control. In the northeast of the country, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are the Kurds, and now they had successfully fought off Islamic State in the area, and they were now in control of that northeastern part of Syria, which included oil fields and a lot of good agricultural lands. So this was a huge blow to the Syrian economy. They also had 1,000 US troops with the SDF in that area. They were there essentially stealing the oil. In the years post-ceasefire, Iran and Russia urged Assad to do something about the situation in Syria. They wanted him to properly train and arm and pay the armed forces because they anticipated that there would be more attempts to unseat him. They also urged him to tackle corruption. It was obviously draining the country's resources, and it caused the regime to lose a lot of whatever support it had. Rather than do that, Assad actually started to turn away from Iran and Russia. He started courting the Gulf states for money, supposedly for rebuilding Syria. However, what money he did get from the Gulf states just went into the same corrupt, rotten structures as it had before. Apparently, he also believed he could come to some sort of accommodation with the West and all of his other enemies, which was completely foolish and misguided. Once they've got you in their sights, they won't stop until you've been overthrown. And they take any kind of attempts to reproach with them as a sign of weakness, and they only redouble their efforts then. So Assad really made a huge number of mistakes and missed so many opportunities to save himself. We're told that as long as 6 weeks before the HTS offensive that ended up deposing him, that Iran had warned him, and Russia had intelligence as well, that something was afoot. But as he had done before with all the advice he'd got from Iran and Russia, he just ignored it. So that brings us to now, when Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the other associated rebel groups are now in control of Damascus and most of the rest of the country. They managed to achieve that with at most about 30,000 soldiers. About 30% of them are foreigners, the rest are Syrians. They were up against what was notionally a 200,000 man army of the Syrian regime, but given the circumstances in the country, the army just didn't want to fight. Maybe some of them were paid off, but they decided it just wasn't worth it. Iran offered help, apparently, through both their proxies and whatever help Hezbollah could offer, although that was limited after their recent fight with Israel. But when they saw what was going on the ground, they figured that it wasn't worth their while because the Syrian army weren't going to fight anyway. So what's the history of the main rebel group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham? They originated as an al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria called the Al-Nusra Front. They had links with both al-Qaeda originally and then later Islamic State. In February of 2014, they cut their links with Islamic State, and then eventually in July 2016, they cut their links with al-Qaeda. They were originally renamed as Jabhat Fatah al-Sham before becoming what they are now, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. That organization is designated as a terrorist group around much of the world, and including in places which are now kind of allied with them. For instance, in Turkey, they're still designated as a terrorist group, although the Turks have been cooperating with them and using them where necessary. Their leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, or as his real name is, which he's now started to use, Ahmed Hussein al-Shara, has a $10 million bounty on his head from the Americans from his time as a leading member of al-Qaeda. He's since denied that he was anything more than a foot soldier in al-Qaeda, and he says that he's no longer a militant jihadist and he's a changed man. HTS has been in control of government and society in Idlib province for a while, and it seems as though they have had less restrictive policies up there. Christians are allowed to practice religion. Shia don't seem to have been persecuted as yet up there. Women are not told how to dress. They're allowed to go out and that type of thing. So it's certainly less restrictive than Islamic State, of course. Some people are still suspicious because at one point they did try and bring in some kind of restrictive stuff like religious police and that type of thing, but the local population kind of rebelled against it, so they backed down. And in some of their policy documents, they talked about Islamization from the ground up, which they described as a strategy to win people's trust and then bring in Islamic government, which sounds a little bit suspicious, like they're hiding their true intentions. And there are still allegations in the media and from NGOs that there has been a lot of mistreatment of women and minorities. So we'll have to wait and see what their true face is. With HTS now firmly in power, it seems, in Damascus, who do you think are the winners and losers in all of this? Well, first of all, we've got to say that people were shocked. All of the major players were shocked that they actually managed to take over the country. It's clear that nobody expected this, and it's clear that this was by no means the plan. So a lot of the assumptions have to go out the window, and we'll have to now wait and see, because it might be a long term thing before we realize who has benefited from this and who hasn't. Turkey's now in control of Aleppo, which there's Turkish flags flying over the city, and this will be something that's been a long term goal of theirs. It was part of the Ottoman Empire until around about the First World War time, and they still believe that it belongs to them. However, on the downside for Turkey, they could be facing a Kurdish state if the Kurdish forces in the northeast decide to declare independence. Not only that, it'll be a Kurdish state which will have oil and a lot of other resources, so that would be an absolute nightmare scenario for Turkey. As far as Israel goes, Netanyahu predictably was on the TV crowing about what a great victory it was for him and for Israel and everything else, and how they'd occupied the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. But Israel still has pretty much all the same problems as they had before. Hamas have not yet been defeated in Gaza, and they certainly haven't defeated Hezbollah in Lebanon. In fact, quite the reverse. That's the second time now after 2006 that they've been forced to withdraw. The land resupply routes for Hezbollah across Syria have been cut. We'll have to see what effect that has. But with HTS in control in Damascus, they have now got jihadists on their borders. It was interesting to note that at Jelani's appearance at the mosque in Damascus, that his supporters were chanting that next they'll be marching to Jerusalem. Now, that might just be bluster, but you got to remember that the guy in charge of this organization has declared that he was initially radicalized by the occupation of the Golan Heights and his family having to leave that area. So I doubt he'll be too well disposed to Israel. On top of all that, you've still got the fact that the Israeli economy's pretty much in ruins. They're totally reliant on the US economically and militarily. They're still basically in control of US government foreign policy, so we'll see what happens, but I wouldn't be popping champagne corks yet if I was Netanyahu. As far as the US goes, they've gotten rid of Assad, which was a personal obsession for them. However, this is an area that has no strategic interest for them, and they've got 1,000 troops that are now probably in more danger than they were before. However, this is only going to encourage the neocons who seem pretty firmly entrenched still in Washington, so we'll see what happens. I've seen a lot of people saying this was a big blow for Russia. Well, I mean, Syria was a nice to have, and they are negotiating about the status of their military, their air base and their naval base. If they lose it, they lose it. I think it's pretty obvious that the Russians had kind of given up on Assad and were expecting what happened to happen. So they won't be too pleased about it, but they're more focused on Europe. They're more focused on Ukraine and completing their victory there. I've really seen a lot of people in the videos that I've watched being pretty downhearted and downcast about Palestine and the Palestinian axis of resistance, saying things like it's over, it's dead, it's gone. Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that. I mean, it's obviously not looking too good at the minute. That resupply land bridge to Hezbollah is cut for now. However, you still have to remember that there's ancient smuggling routes in Syria, and they're not going to go away just because HTS is in charge in Damascus. So they'll find a way probably to resupply Hezbollah. And in any case, Hezbollah is so much more advanced now. They have their own weapons production, even their own missile production. So I'm not sure we should be writing their obituary just yet. It might be a lot more difficult for Hamas, depending on where they were getting their weapons and support from in the first place. We'll have to see there, but they're certainly more isolated now than they were before. It's pretty much been said by everybody that Iran is the big loser here. Well, possibly. I was watching an interview with Professor Mohammed Marandi, and he said that Syria was always the weakest link in the so-called axis of resistance, and they also knew that Assad's regime was going to go down, so they've prepared for it. They obviously it's a blow to them because they've lost their influence in Syria. What Iran should be more worried about is that the neocons will be flush with success here, and they're going to turn their attention immediately to Iran, especially with Netanyahu egging them on. The new Iranian president has been for some time trying to make nice with the West, seeing if they could come to some accommodation or rapprochement. That's a waste of time. They're now going to be dead set on getting rid of the Iranian regime. And I saw John Mearsheimer say in an interview that if the Iranian regime wants to survive, the thing it really needs to do is to get nuclear weapons as quickly as possible. I mean, look at what happened with North Korea. They were getting threatened almost on a daily basis about they were going to get overthrown, and as soon as they demonstrated they had nuclear weapons, all of a sudden, what happened to that? The North Korean regime's safer now than it's ever been. So we'll have to see what happens when Trump comes in, but there's no doubt Iran's in the crosshairs. Finally, one would hope that the Syrian people will become the winners out of this. It's not too promising with the people who are currently in charge in Damascus, but hopefully they can get peace and something resembling prosperity, because they've really been through a rough time over the last 15 years. So feel free to give your opinions in the comments section. Try and keep it respectful. I know this is an area of the world that evokes strong opinions, but it always creates an interest in dialogue. Thanks for watching, and like and subscribe if you would.